Hold on, I need to unmute you. I'm going to stop the recording. There you go. Okay, I'm going to unmute. Hold on, Rama. I'm going to unmute you first. Don't talk yet, though. So now you're self-muted. All right. Okay, now I'm going to. Can you hear me now? Yeah. Let me see if I can stop and start the recording. Oh, well. Go ahead. We'll split the first part.
We'll split it up. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Rama Kudemi. I'm the Director of Grassroots Organizing at the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights, a national coalition of hundreds of groups working together for freedom, justice, and equality. And we're really honored to have all of you on here today on this very important webinar dealing with the topic of debunking the myth of citizenship from the U.S. to Israel. This webinar is part of our bigger curriculum of the year under the title of Together We Rise, Palestine as a Model of Resistance, in which we have been sharing throughout the year resources and an analysis to really strengthen our collective liberation struggles from the U.S. to Palestine, something that is particularly important in this political moment as we see more and more resistance and pushback against Trump's right-wing agenda. And we know that this is something that is not new with Trump, that there is a history of structural oppression here. There's a history of who is and is not considered a citizen. There's a history of what we're talking about, of whose lives matter and whose lives don't matter. And so this is a very important topic as part of this greater curriculum, especially under the subtopic of freedom-bound, resisting Zionism and white supremacy, and really making the links between U.S. and Israeli colonialism and racism and kind of the lessons we can draw from various struggles, again, from the U.S. to Palestine that we can build on to really push back against what the right-wing agenda is right now in this country and all across the globe. So I'm really honored to turn it over to Nadia Ben Youssef, who is a steering committee member of the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights, as well as the director of Adalah Justice Project. So thank you so much, Nadia. She's going to be facilitating our webinar.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Rama and Anna, and welcome to all of you who are joining us. We are so thrilled to share this space with you, and we're considering it a space of co-education. So that means we're centering the narratives of communities and people who are resisting oppression. We're exchanging information and critically engaging in self-reflection. So today, as Rama said, we're debunking myths about citizenship in Israel and the United States. And to do that, we need to confront elements of our own miseducation. So we're going to think together about how nation states are built on exclusion and how citizenship has political and economic dimensions. Rama asked those questions. Who is considered a citizen and why? So Israel and the United States have living histories of racial or ethnic prerequisites to citizenship. And this has profound implications on access to resources, to opportunity, and of course to the full realization of human rights, including the right to life. Who the state considers a citizen rather than, say, a security threat or a demographic threat or an existential threat determines with dangerous consequences whether or not that state values that person's life. In 1961, I love this quote, Malcolm X spoke to a young student who had just returned from organizing in the South. And he said to that student, to be a citizen means that you have the rights of a citizen. If you haven't got the rights of a citizen, then you are not a citizen. So as Rama said, I direct the Adalah Justice Project, and this is the new US-based sister organization of Adalah, the Legal Center for Arab Minority Rights in Israel. We're a group of lawyers and advocates who represent Palestinians through Israeli legal channels. And for Palestinians who are citizens of Israel, this is 20% of the population of Israel, this means that we're fighting for their rights as citizens. But what is citizenship to non-Jews in a self-defined Jewish state? We'll answer some of those questions. And we're actually going to begin our conversation diving a bit deeper into the construction of citizenship in Israel for both Palestinians as well as Jews of color. So Rebecca Pearce will join us soon. And we do this in part to develop what I understand as Palestine eyes. And I owe this phrase to a comrade in the student immigration movement who in Haifa last summer offered this concept to me. And he was paraphrasing an elder and a grassroots organizer named Marshall Gans, who said that he needed, this is in the Freedom Summer, to get his Mississippi eyes in order to understand and see structural discrimination in his home state of California. And similarly, by recognizing how citizenship is constructed in Israel to both privilege the rights of Jewish people and deny the rights of Palestinians, I think we begin to think differently about citizenship in the United States. And particularly for those of us who are not native, our position as settlers with citizenship on stolen land. I often describe the work of the Adalah Justice Project as de-exceptionalizing Israel and Palestine for American audiences. So bringing Palestinian rights into a larger progressive framework. And this means two things. First, it means that if you have an opinion about equality, about racial justice, about standing with communities who are resisting oppression, you have an opinion about Palestine. But perhaps the reverse is even more important, which is that by having an opinion about Palestine, it means you are committed to dismantling white supremacy, to challenging racism and anti-Semitism, and you are dedicated to the liberation of Native people. This is our community, and we are honored to be bound up in this struggle with you, and I'm excited for what's ahead and grateful for the panelists. We're going to get started with Youssef Munayyer, the executive director of the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights, and also a Palestinian citizen of Israel, again, to get a bit deeper into the construction of citizenship in Israel. And before you start, Youssef, just a reminder for those who joined a bit late, you can ask questions on the side and we'll try to answer them as we go. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Nadia. Can you guys hear me okay? Great. So yeah, thank you for that introduction, and thank you to everyone else who is participating in this important conversation. I did want to talk a little bit about what it means to be a Palestinian citizen of Israel, from personal experience, obviously. I was born in Israel, a Palestinian. My family likes to say we didn't cross the border crossed us. Obviously, our lineage was there predating the state of Israel for centuries. But on top of being a Palestinian citizen of Israel, I also happen to be a Palestinian citizen of the United States. And that experience gives me an opportunity to kind of think about the ways in which citizenship plays out here in the United States and how that differs from citizenship playing out in Israel, and how it can sometimes be difficult for people familiar with an American context to relate to the challenges of Palestinian citizens of Israel because of that. We often think about citizenship here in the United States as a sort of gold standard of belonging in society. And from the foundation of the United States, citizenship was supposed to be held up as that, even though who was considered a citizen varied depended on who those in power wanted to keep out of power. And battles raged here in the United States for decades after that to ensure that all people were created equal, regardless of their gender and regardless of their race and so on. And even after that took place in the United States, the civil rights movement had to ensure that, as Nadia was pointing out, just because you had citizenship in the nominal sense, that you had the rights to citizenship, because there were plenty of ways that the states and other governments could restrict your rights of citizenship if they were not guaranteed. But in Israel, it's a slightly different situation. Citizenship is not the gold standard of belonging. Citizenship is actually a category of exclusion. And that, from the American perspective, is sometimes difficult to understand. But to really grasp it, you have to understand how the concept of citizenship in Israel was developed and why it was developed, which is more important. And you have to keep in mind that Israel was founded in 1948. The modern state of Israel was founded in 1948 amidst the massive depopulation of the native population of Palestine. And this meant that the vast majority of the native inhabitants throughout the course of the war that established the state of Israel were forced outside the boundaries of the state once it was created, and were refugees when the state was created, and denied repatriation by the state. So from 1948, when the state was declared, till 1952, when the state actually passed its nationality or citizenship law, there were no citizens in Israel. The state didn't have a category of citizenship in Israel. So they ended up creating a category of citizenship to serve a very specific purpose. The Jewish community in Israel that was empowered after the war and became a majority of the population was facing a conundrum. They wanted to become accepted by the international community, and what many people don't know is Israel's first application to join the United Nations was denied in large part because they failed to adhere to certain standards of citizenship and equality and so on. They were facing this conundrum of how is it that we are able to say we want to allow Jews from all over the world to immigrate to Israel, but we don't want to allow these Palestinians to come back, even though they're residents who are in refugee status at this point. And so to get around this problem, what they wanted to do was institute a system of discrimination to allow people of a certain background to be able to come in while preventing others from being able to come in. They set up a series of laws, and the order in which they did that was very important. First, they set up something called the Law of Return in 1950, which is sort of euphemistically named because it permits people who never once existed inside the State of Israel to enter into the State of Israel and to gain residency in the State of Israel. So that means if you were a Jewish person born in San Francisco, for example, and never been to Israel, the Law of Return allowed you to come in and to belong to the society there. But then they had this problem of, well, okay, if we're bringing in Jews from all over the world into Israel, who gets to vote? Who gets to participate in society? And how can we say that, you know, the people who are on the borders waiting to return as refugees are not permitted to return? So they passed two more laws. One was an infiltrators law, what they called an infiltrators law, that specifically prevented the return or entry of people who were previous residents. So it was specifically targeting refugees, saying, okay, you guys cannot come back in. And then they created another category of citizenship for people who were not Jewish, not coming in under the Law of Return, and just happened to still be residing in the state. In other words, the people who were left over through the process of ethnic cleansing, people like my family. So citizenship was created as a way to essentially create the facade of belonging, the facade of equality, but was really the instrument that was used to justify the denial of people's rights. And it is from that foundation that everything stems. So it's from that philosophy that the number of Palestinians within the Israeli state needs to be controlled, limited, prevented, quarantined, what have you. Everything else flows from that. And this is why, for example, every year on the New Year in Israel, there is census numbers produced, and there is conversation about how many Palestinians exist in the state today. And we are commonly referred to as demographic threats to the state, merely by virtue of our existence, not because of any actions that we have carried out or not carried out, but merely by virtue of our existence. And here I will just mention, out of personal experience, what this has meant for me, for example. And you know, Palestinian citizens of Israel experience this discrimination in a variety of different ways, which we could fill many webinars discussing. But just to give you a brief example about my personal experience, as I said, I happen to be a Palestinian citizen of Israel, you know, born in the same town as my ancestors were, so I didn't go anywhere. And I happened to marry a Palestinian who is a citizen of the West Bank, a resident of the West Bank. Now, she doesn't have citizenship status in Israel. But what this means is, because of this philosophy that the state adheres to, that the existence of Palestinians and the continued existence of Palestinians in specific numbers constitute a threat to the state of Israel, my wife and I are unable to reside in the state in which I was born, where I am a citizen, whereas those rules do not apply to Jewish Israelis who marry people from outside of the country and are able to bring them in, precisely because their children don't pose a continued demographic threat to the state. And so laws were created to actually ensure that our shared residency would not be possible, all for the purpose of ensuring that our children would not exist within those borders. And so we're talking about a system that considers us citizens, but at the same time fears existentially the prospect of our unborn children. And this, I think, is something that makes citizenship there quite a myth.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Yusuf, for that, and also for that personal testimony. I want to turn now to Rebecca Pearce, who is a filmmaker, a writer, and an organizer with the Jews of Color and Sephardi Mizrahi Caucus, partner of Jewish Voice for Peace. Rebecca, I think you are on the line, and we're looking forward to hearing your thoughts.
Hi, everyone. I'm really happy to be here today. Thanks for having me. Good to see some familiar faces. You know, like Nadia said, I'm part of the Jews of Color Sephardi Mizrahi Caucus, organized in partnership with JVP, and we're basically working to, you know, present another face of Jewish solidarity with Palestinians, coming from a racial justice perspective and coming from the perspective of Jewish people who both benefit from Zionism and Israeli settler colonialism and have been victimized by it, and trying to sort of hold this very complicated place in a space of, you know, meaningful solidarity. So I'm going to talk a little bit today about the status and relationship to citizenship that Jewish people of color and also Soviet Jewish folks have with the state of Israel. And when I talk about these things, I always like to start off with just reframing like the idea of Zionism, because it's really important to understand this as the foundational ideology of the state of Israel. Zionism is a form of nationalism that was put forth by European Jewish folks responding to European nationalism, fascism, and anti-Semitism. What it ended up doing was recreating a lot of these things. And you know, in the process of coming up with this movement that started out in the 1890s, the early Zionist leadership, or the thought leaders of this movement, were not considering Jewish people from the Middle East, from Africa, from Asia. They were really talking about, when they said Jews, they were talking about European, what we call Ashkenazi Jews, Jews from Central and Eastern Europe. And that was, when they talked about Jewish culture, informed the cultural nationalism aspect of Zionism, they were really talking about Ashkenazi Jewish culture. So when it came to creating the state on top of the ruins of, like, you know, this massive displacement of Palestinians, the people, you know, being considered the state were thought to be European, but there, because of the Holocaust, were not enough European Jews to actually create, you know, this demographic balance that they wanted, that had a majority Jewish versus minority non-Jewish Palestinian population. So this was when people first started talking about bringing in Jewish people from the Middle East and North Africa. And, you know, what happened when these populations were brought in was that people's passports were taken away from them. If you were coming from places like Yemen or Morocco, you could not go back because you literally didn't have the documents to prove that you were from there. People were pressured to stop speaking Arabic because this was the language of the enemy. The Zionist leadership was worried, and rightfully so, that people would, from the Mizrahi communities, that's Jewish people from the Middle East, would build relationships with Palestinians. And there are many cases of transit camps where Moroccan, Iraqi, other Middle Eastern Jewish people were being held where like people in these communities would start to reach out to local Palestinians nearby and form relationships, and the camps would be totally destroyed and disbanded by the government to prevent this from happening. You know, because Zionism was a mostly European Jewish phenomenon, many people, for example, in the Iraqi community, which was very left-wing, often communist, really rejected it. And there was very explicit attempts to break up any political organizing that was happening against the government at the time. You know, there were also, not at the same level what happened to Palestinians, obviously, but there were demographic concerns as well. And, you know, one of the big social issues within Israeli Jewish society right now is the kidnapping of the Yemenite and other Mizrahi Jewish children in the 1950s. This was a massive crime in which 1 in 8 Yemeni babies born in Israel in the 1950s were taken from their parents. Their parents were told they were dead, and they didn't receive any death certificate or notification of where the child was buried. And usually what happened was 18 years later, they would get a draft notice indicating that the government didn't actually think their children were dead. What happened to these kids is they were adopted out to mostly Ashkenazi Jewish families. Some of them were experimented on. And people thought this was all a conspiracy for a really long time until documents recently came out showing that this happened. But this was explicitly to make these children whiter, to give them like the culturally Ashkenazi household that people thought was better. You know, and this plays into the European supremacy that's really embedded in a lot of the Zionist movement and ideology. And I think when we're talking about citizenship specifically, it's important to talk about the different designations you can have as a Jew in Israel, which I don't think people are very familiar with. You can be Jewish enough, quote unquote, to receive citizenship under the law of return. All you need is a Jewish grandparent, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you're Jewish according to like the state religious authorities in Israel. And there's a large population of people who are both, you know, whether you're Ethiopian, Soviet Jewish, a patrilineal Reform Jew like myself. Like if you were to immigrate to Israel, you would be given a status within the country as other. You can't get married within the state of Israel. There's no civil marriage. If you're not recognized as a Jew by the rabbinical courts, you're not eligible for marriage. And this is these same courts preside over family law and a lot of basic access to rights that people have. You can also be discriminated against on the in housing situations for the same purpose or same reason. And studies have shown that people who are branded other in Israeli society have some of the highest rates of leaving the country and the highest rates of suicide in the country. So there's a really direct connection between the extent to which you're perceived as Jewish and the material rights that you have in the state, and also like this bigger question of like, are you happy and able to live your life there? The main path to upward mobility for people in Jews of color, Soviet Jews, and people in the working class and lower ranks of the society is Israeli military. And this is a very insidious thing because it forces people to become directly complicit on another level than they already were in the settler colonial project. And in exchange, they're supposed to be getting rights and status in the society. There are many jobs that if you apply for and you have no army service, you will not get. There are also state benefits that you won't get. So a lot of people, especially in Ethiopian, Mizrahi, and Soviet Jewish communities, feel very strongly that if they were to not do this, if they were to refuse their army service, they would have no path forward in the society. And it's very much viewed among some of these populations that refusing your army service is a white privilege. It's something that's said a lot. But we're seeing some changes around that right now where there's a movement of Ethiopian Jews who are refusing to do their army reserve duty. Unfortunately, not out of solidarity with Palestinians, but because they feel that the basic social contract that if you serve in the army, you're given the full rights of citizenship. They feel like this contract is being reneged on by the Israeli government. They're not holding up their end of the deal. So they're saying, why should we serve in your military if we're not getting any rights, if we're still being incarcerated at extremely high levels? Something like 40% of Ethiopians in the Israeli military are incarcerated. And this is because they're the breadwinners of their family and military service takes them away from being able to work. People are beaten all the time by the police. There was a video of a Ethiopian soldier in his uniform being beaten by the police, which in Israel, the most respectable thing you can be is a soldier. So this was really traumatic for people because they said, what's the point of us serving your army if you're not going to treat us with basic respect even when we're in the uniform. So I did a series of videos, interviews with some of these soldiers, and if people are interested, I think there's going to be a link posted. And one of the things that they talk about is the fact that increasingly, as Ethiopians especially have strong social movements and protests in Israel, both around police brutality and also issues like the forced sterilization of Ethiopian women, which relates back to that demographic question, and other policies like this. They're seeing increasingly Israeli forces using the same tactics of the occupation on these Ethiopian protesters. And there is some awareness of, while people, for a lot of reasons, have still very much bought into Zionism as a way of proving their citizenship, there is an awareness of what's happening to Palestinians among especially the younger generation. And some people are even looking to try to build off of or like learn from the tactics being used by Palestinians. And so I think that situations like this, there's still a huge, there's like a power dynamic, obviously, between any Israeli person, especially someone who's serving in the army, and any Palestinian person. But there's also, I think a lot of the people organizing with the caucus think a very common cause against what Zionism has done in terms of, discriminating and really destroying the communities and cultures of Jewish people of color. And in that way, we do have a common cause with Palestinians in trying to fight for a, egalitarian system that respects and honors the rights of every person living on that land. And this is not to say that every Jewish person of color is there yet or thinking about these things, and there's a big problem with right-wing nationalism in our communities, but for a lot of us, we see the only way forward as being, side by side with Palestinians and resisting the settler colonial project that has we both benefited from, but has really destroyed our communities.
Thank you so much for that, Rebecca, and we're looking forward to also seeing and sharing your films. And I think you're bringing us to a conversation that I hope we get to a bit at the end of the webinar in terms of building our struggle and joining together in common cause. I think as we do co-education, as we study together, what we're doing is developing common terms of struggle. How do we understand these systems and structures, and how do we resist hierarchies of human life wherever they happen and wherever we fall on that ladder? I want to turn now and bring our Palestine eyes to focus on the United States. And I'm going to turn to Nick Estes, who's a scholar and an activist and the co-founder of the Red Nation, to bring us home, as it will. And again, if you have, I'm noticing that there are some questions on the chat, so if some of the panelists want to look to those, and if others want to submit their questions, please do so. Nick.
Hamid. My name is Nick, and I'm here calling from San Bernardino, California, which is San Manuel territory. And I just want to kind of talk about how I got involved in this work to begin with, especially Palestine Solidarity. It began a long time ago when I was in college and talking to older activists, particularly grandmothers from the American Indian movement, who were telling me about their trips to places like Lebanon and visiting Palestinian refugee camps, but also some of them had gone to Palestine as well. But also a lot of Palestinians came over to the United States to support the movement, the indigenous movement back in the 1970s, especially the international element of that movement. And is there, can I do my screen share on here? I don't know, I had the little slide for some pictures. But anyways, okay. I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about, I don't know if you can see this.
We see a Word document. There we go.
Okay. I just wanted to throw out a definition of settler colonialism, because I think people come to settler colonialism either through Israeli settler colonialism, or they come to settler colonialism through North American settler colonialism. But this is a working definition that I've come up with. Settler colonialism is a specific form of colonialism whereby an imperial power seizes native territory, eliminates the original people by force, removal, and political liquidation, which includes like eliminating sort of their governance structures, and resettles the land with a foreign invading population. Unlike other forms of colonialism, where the colonizers rule from afar and sometimes leave, settler colonialism attempts to permanently and completely replace natives with a settler population. And in that sense, settlers come to stay, and how they come to stay, as Yusuf really showed in his presentation, is by creating sort of senses of belonging, whether it's cultural or whether it's through the legal modes of citizenship. And sort of part of that, I created a little sort of history of U.S. citizenship for non-Europeans in the sort of settler colonial context. And I just picked 4 sort of instances that deal specifically with indigeneity, as well as non-white people. And sort of the interesting thing about these particular cases is that in no case did these groups enter the constitutional framework as individuals, but they entered the constitutional framework as citizens, as entire groups, which is, you know, when we think of citizenship and sort of naturalization, we think of it as a sort of individual process. But in these cases specifically, it relates to sort of like the settler colonial project. For example, the 1848 Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo made Mexicans, quote unquote, citizens of the United States. And within that treaty itself, it delineated sort of degrees of civilization and those who were eligible for immediate U.S. citizenship. For example, former Mexican citizens who had sort of embraced their quote-unquote European heritage, such as Spanish heritage, became citizens much faster than other sort of mestizo or Genízaro populations. And below that, those who were denied, categorically denied citizenship, were called the quote-unquote savage Indians, which included the Comanches, the Apaches, the Navajos, and ironically, the Pueblo Indians of the Southwest were granted citizenship. They were actually citizens of Mexico, but it created sort of degrees of citizenship. And what happened in places like Arizona as well as New Mexico is that you had a large sort of non-white population in each of these territories, these organized territories, who had to effectively become white by law and sort of embrace or create or fabricate a sort of European-derived identity, which, you know, the category of Spanish American, which is now sort of Hispanic, was created to sort of deny sort of like indigenous descended people. And then, of course, you have the 1868 14th Amendment, which made former black slave citizens. A lot of, you know, Christian can talk a little bit more about that. But also, like, in, you know, as Yusuf brought up, this wasn't sort of like a formal guarantee after Reconstruction, and some would argue that there was a second Reconstruction during the Black Freedom Movement, also known as the Civil Rights Movement in the 1950s and 60s. And sort of after the 14th Amendment came in 1871, the abolition of indigenous treaty making, which effectively made indigenous peoples an internal population. And how it made indigenous peoples an internal population is that you don't make treaties with quote unquote domestic groups, right? And so there's this sort of quasi independent status of indigenous nations prior to 1871, where the United States was effectively making treaties with individual indigenous nations as if they were sovereign nations. Well, at the same time, they were making treaties, like, for example, with us, like the 1868 Fort Laramie Treaty. They were effectively removing indigenous peoples in sort of the southeast and the eastern seaboard. And then came sort of like formal citizenship in 1924, which with the Indian Citizenship Act, which unilaterally made all indigenous peoples citizens of the United States. And sort of the origins of that particular act are really important to talk about, because Rebecca was talking about military service. Indigenous peoples during World War I served at higher rates than any other population in the United States. 1 in 4 Native men in the U.S. volunteered or were conscripted into military service during the First World War, and a majority, 3/4 of them, were not even considered citizens of the United States. And others, some would argue that they were fighting for citizenship, and so therefore they volunteered for military service so that they could become citizens. But others would also say that individual indigenous nations sent their people to war as separate nations, and even like the Haudenosaunee Confederacy during this time actually made a separate declaration of war against Germany, and they did so as well in World War II against the Axis powers. So there's sort of this kind of in between where there were some movements towards citizenship, whereas there was sort of a definite sort of strident indigenous nationalism that said we're sending our own units, we're sending our own people as separate nations to go to war. And I think that sort of the fallout of all of this is that the 1924 Citizenship Act was never a guarantee for like quote unquote full citizenship of indigenous peoples. I'm going to turn off the screen sharing thing. I don't know how to do it, but because I don't know how much time I have left. But what's interesting about people such as my nation, the Oceti-Sakowin, the Great Sioux Nation, also known as like Lakota people, we have sort of what we call like a dual citizenship. We have our own membership with our own tribes, and we determine sort of who belongs and who doesn't belong. Like, for example, our tribe doesn't have a blood quantum requirement, so we can actually effectively adopt people in and make them honorary citizens how we choose to do so. But also the sort of category of citizenship and belonging within our own territory, our own treaty territory, has been subject to question. In the 1950s, there was a mass relocation of our nation after they built dams on our river, which flooded, over 500,000 acres of land, and it relocated over a third of our population. As a result, we moved to places that we call like border towns, which are these white-dominated settlements that ring Indian reservations, and in places like Rapid City, South Dakota, which is at the heart of our sort of moral and political universe known as Sapa, or the Black Hills of South Dakota. And in the 1930s and the 1940s and 50s, because of this relocation, the state of South Dakota passed what were called warning out laws and issued what were called certificates of non-residence, which actually barred indigenous peoples from state citizenship. So they couldn't vote, they couldn't receive welfare, they couldn't, they couldn't rent, they couldn't own land, all these things if they were off reservation. And that wasn't effectively repealed until 1973. But it was a way to sort of police this off-reservation presence, and to sort of like, there was some sort of overlap and similarities in what Rebecca was talking about as well, when you had, during this time, you had what was called child removal, Indian child removal, where indigenous children were removed from their families and sent to live with white families. And this happened during the time of okay. So I'm out of time. I was sorry, Nadia, but I guess I can just hopefully maybe answer some questions that people have.
No, I didn't mean to cut you off just so abruptly. Thank you so much, Nick. That was, it's excellent. And I want us to consider what you said too in terms of 1924 was never really a guarantee of full citizenship. And what does that mean when citizenship is enshrined in law and yet doesn't amount to the protections, the privileges, the rights that we would expect as citizens? And we'll plug some exciting news for Nick later. And I just want to turn us now to Christian Davis-Bailey, a writer and an organizer, particularly with Black for Palestine, to take us kind of through a bit of a deeper process as well, and then we'll turn it over, if we have a bit more time, to some questions. But we're closing out with Christian. Thank you so much for being here.
And if people have questions for Nick or anyone else, just type them into the questions feature.
Great. Thank you, Nadia, and thank you to my fellow presenters and to everybody that's on the call with us today. I just want to start out by noting that I'm talking to you from Detroit, which is the city that emerged out of French and British colonialism on Anishinaabe territory, and is currently the largest black city in the country, where tens of thousands of people are having their water shut off by the state. And so these questions about citizenship are very relevant, and they have real-life implications even today. But what I want to do is give a bit of a broader historical overview of what our experience of citizenship here has been as black people, broadening that to the experiences of other groups on this territory, and then comparing that to what citizenship has looked like in Palestine. And so I just want to start by showing a map that most of us are familiar with. Can you see that? Disappearing Palestine? I'm
yes.
assuming you can. Okay, great.
Yes, we can.
So we're all familiar with that map, but how many of us are familiar with this one, the disappearing sovereignty of indigenous peoples and nations over the territory that we now know as the United States? And I just want to raise this map to continue what Nick was discussing, the notion of settler colonialism, not just in Palestine, but also on this territory. And to say that some of us may have seen or used similar maps. How would you feel if your land disappeared in the way that Palestine's has? We've mapped that onto the US or Canada or Australia. And for all of these countries, that's inappropriate because all of that land has already been stolen from indigenous populations. And so, as Yusuf was saying, we didn't cross the borders crossed us, both in the case of populations living on Turtle Island, North America, and for people living in Palestine. And I'm going to stop showing my screen so I can read my remarks. But I think one of the first things I want to stress is that in the case of countries like the US or Israel, the very notion of citizenship exists to legitimate colonialism, and it exists to erase the indigenous population who cannot lay claim to sovereignty over lands that were originally theirs. And so from the outset, the identity of being an American citizen is not something that we should want or strive towards if we believe in indigenous sovereignty and if we oppose colonialism. And I think when we're talking about citizenship, the citizen is a unit of the state. So it's also important to discuss what is the nature of the state, or what does the state do? And so all states, whether they're colonial or not, maintain a monopoly over who has justified use of force. And it's we often use the concept of citizenship or nationality to determine who, both within the borders of a state and outside of the borders of the state can commit violence against with impunity. And so one way to answer the question of what is citizenship or who is a citizen is to ask, who can the state commit violence against with impunity, and who does it face punishment for committing violence against? And when we also look at citizenship, we need to be asking, what does it do, and whose interest does it act, and who gets excluded by it? And so, as I mentioned, I want to start by talking about the experiences of black people on what's currently known as the United States, and then broaden that to other populations that are also here. And so when we look at black people, how did we get to this territory? We got here because we were stolen by Europeans from our lands and territories in Africa and brought to settle the United States. And so even in that moment, there was no respect for whatever local, there wasn't citizenship because there were no nations when we were taken from the continent. But there was still no respect for the sovereignty of the people living on the territory. And so they bring us to the United States, and we're not granted citizenship. In fact, we're denied citizenship. We're even told that we're not full people. And that exists for, doing some slow math, but that exists for just about 100 years in the United States, when all of a sudden, following the end of the Civil War, we were unilaterally granted citizenship. So one day we're not citizens, and the next day we are citizens, and there was never any question, hey, do you even want to be part of this project called the United States? Do you even want citizenship? So similar to what happened in 1924, citizenship was unilaterally pushed upon us as Black people. But even with the so-called rights or privileges of citizenship, we saw that we weren't fully treated equally under the law. And that's still a struggle that we're fighting and inheriting today, both through the civil rights movement and Black Power movement, all the way up through the movement for Black lives today. And so we have citizenship, but it's been something that has been, it's layered. So we have access to certain rights, but we can also be killed with impunity, and nobody faces any punishment for that. And so when we look at other populations, this includes native, immigrant, and poor populations, none of these has ever fully been given the rights of the state. When the United States was founded, it was founded for the benefit of wealthy, landowning white men. Over time, white women gained the right to vote. Over time, poor people gained the right to vote. Over time, Native and Black people gained the right to vote. But citizenship or voting isn't the be-all, end-all of citizenship. And what we've seen over time is that different immigrant populations have access to this country, have access to citizenship based on, one, the labor needs of the state. So when the US needed to build a railroad from coast to coast, it imported a number of Chinese immigrants and exploited their labor. And it's also based on whether these populations are seen as a threat. So at various times over history, we've seen the Irish, the Italians, Chinese, Japanese, Eastern and South Europeans either vilified and seen as barbaric or threats or dangerous, or if they behave well enough, they've been able to incorporate into citizenship and to take on the process or the project of US colonialism and empire building. Then we also see, let me just look at my notes. We also see that certain populations are excluded from citizenship. So all of our undocumented family, who are in the millions, over 10 million in this country, don't have any of the protections of citizenship, even though they're here largely due to this country destabilizing their own countries and are seeking, fleeing either situations of war or economic violence. And so what I want to do is show, here's how I show that. I'd like to just look at how the hierarchy of citizenship operates in the US and how it operates in Palestine. So in the US, we see that whiteness is the sort of model for citizenship. Blackness is the antithesis of that, and immigrant groups kind of have fluctuating positions in between those two things. But who is excluded? It's the native and indigenous people who don't have any claim to sovereignty over their land, and it's undocumented people who I'll consider refugees. In Israel, as Rebecca has pointed out, and Yusuf, we see European Jews at the top, Palestinian citizens of Israel at the bottom, and in between that we see Russian, North African, and Middle Eastern Jews, and below those, Ethiopian Jews. And who's excluded from those categories are Sudanese and Eritrean asylum seekers, are Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, and most notably Palestinian refugees that live outside of Palestine in Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and around the world. These are groups that do not have any access to the rights of so-called citizenship of Israel. And so with these hierarchies, it's really important for us to note that we have to align ourselves and unite with the people at the bottom of the hierarchy and with the people that are excluded entirely by the hierarchy. And it's the joint struggle or work of those populations that can overthrow systems of white supremacy, of racism, of colonialism, and of oppression. And so just as we move into discussion, I think one thing that's important for us to consider is what does it look like to go beyond citizenship? Because citizenship, we understand, is always built on excluding a population. So what is the vision of the world that we're building towards, or that we're trying to create, both here and in Palestine? And how do we avoid some of the pitfalls of nation building, of nationalism, of excluding populations, or even oppressing our own populations when the elite from our group is granted power? to oppress the rest or the masses of our population. We see this with the Palestinian Authority today. But the biggest question is this contradiction around people having a right to sovereignty and a right to declare even nationhood over their own territory, and the steering away from leading into the oppression of our own people and other people. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Christian. Great slides. To those of you who are using visuals, that's super impressive. Thank you to all of our panelists. And we've gotten some interesting questions on the side. We have just a little bit of time. I want to really respect the time of our audience too, and keep us as close to an hour as possible. Know that the webinar is being recorded, so you'll have access to going back to some of these presentations, which I think merit a lot of deep study and self-reflection. And Natasha, I see that you asked for recommended reading material, and what we'll do is compile some of those recommendations and send them in a follow-up email to participants on the webinar. I saw some interesting reflections from our audience about how similar these things sound, how similar when you're putting these conversations side by side. You hear a lot of resonance, certainly, and I think in hearing that resonance, you have to start holding up a mirror to yourself. You have to hold up a mirror, and where are we complicit in these same systems and structures, and what do we need to do in order to reimagine the world that we're living in? And I think, Christian, you're bringing us to a great question. What does this look like? How do we create nations that are not exclusionary? What does that look like? What is citizenship that guarantees full equality and rights? And how do we move and achieve historic justice in Palestine and on Turtle Island? What does that look like? I wonder if, rather than kind of going through any questions, if I could give you just kind of a 2-minute reflection on moving forward. I know, Yusuf, in our run through yesterday, you talked about moving from awareness to action. So now that you've heard some of this as our audience and as we're starting to think about things a bit differently, what does that mean? What does it require of us moving forward, and particularly in engaging in joint struggle and showing up in solidarity? So I will kind of go in reverse order, if that's okay. Christian, oh no, Deva, we'll start from the top. Yusuf, and then we'll end with Christian. So Yusuf, if you can just give us final reflections, thank you.
Sorry. Yeah, I mean, I think we were talking about this a little bit yesterday. I mean, as we've discussed, all of these things are connected in many ways. The similarities, the parallels. It's not something that you can deny. And you know, we were talking about, as I had mentioned in the beginning of this, I am a Palestinian citizen of Israel, but I'm also a Palestinian citizen here in the United States. And what does it mean to be you know, someone who comes from a background of a people who have been depopulated from their land, be ethnically cleansed, and then to come here and live in a society on a land that was very much ethnically cleansed of its native people, and to then benefit from the systems that were built on top of that injustice, and fundamentally resulted in the privileging of some people and you know, the oppression of others. And I think it means constantly working to understand that in our daily life, how that manifests itself, and also how it's continuing to manifest itself against those who are alive today. Those who continue to bear the burden of that historic oppression through its legacy today. And while we may not be able to go back in time and go back in history and change what has taken place, we can do something today to work to change the oppressive legacy that historic injustice has left behind. And I think as people who are living off of the benefit of that oppression, we have a special obligation to commit ourselves to doing that.
Thank you, Yusuf. Rebecca?
Could someone else go next? Sorry, I'm still thinking because I was listening to Yusuf.
I was also listening to Yusuf. Nick?
Sure. Yeah, I think just to kind of piggyback off of what Yusuf said, you know, it's not about we're sitting here trying to blame people for the you know, the misdeeds of their ancestors, but the truth is that, you know, some of those things may have been in the past, but the truth of the matter is that the United States never stopped being settler colonial, and it never stopped being an empire. And so when we talk about a lot of these sort of movements that have arisen against the Muslim ban, against you know, even in Charlottesville more recently, but even as we talk about Palestine, it can't be a move towards U.S. nationalism and flag waving. It's insulting, first and foremost, because people are talking about removing the Confederate flag, which it should be, but we have to remember that slavery flew under the flag of the United States, of our current flag, but also indigenous genocide flew under the flag of the United States as well, you know, as continuing onwards as well. But also as we think about obligations as people living in the belly of the beast of empire, we have to remember that the $30 billion that's being used to fund the expropriation of Palestinians is wealth extracted from this land here. And that when we think about sort of the kind of horizontalism that that Christian is proposing, that we have to imagine you know, a world, like what would a world without empire look like? You know, what proliferates in the absence of empire? And in the United States, people, you know, think that love has to be towards the state, but what if love was towards the land instead? And I think indigenous peoples are thinking about that in the sense that when you remove when you remove empire, and what proliferates in the absence of empire is actually indigenous governance, because we are still nations and we never went away. And to sort of talk about what Christian had brought up about the pitfalls of nationalism, I would say that indigenous nationalism in the United States has its sort of reactionary and conservative tendencies, but at the same time, if we look at like what it means to uphold indigenous sovereignty and what it means to uphold political autonomy for indigenous peoples and indigenous nations in the US, we can look to the recent example of Standing Rock. When people said, we want to uphold treaty rights, it wasn't that we're going to kick all the white people and all the settlers off the land. It was, no, we welcomed people into our circle. We welcomed people there. And what ended up happening in the absence of the state is that you had free health clinics that were built. You had a free school that was built. You had people who were fed on a daily basis, things that most poor communities in the United States don't have access to. And so we have to remember that these are incredibly pessimistic views of humanity that are sort of ingrained within the state structure, as well as citizenship, that they're based on exclusion and violence. And the sort of material sort of evidence of Standing Rock sort of proves otherwise, that there is, you know, another world possible. And I would like to say that the first day that I arrived in Standing Rock, there was a Palestinian man who was in Yankton who grew up on the river. He heard about Standing Rock and he drove up. And it was the first day that I arrived at Standing Rock, and he and I built a free cook shack that actually stood until the Army Corps of Engineers demolished it. So I just wanted to kind of put that plug in.
That's awesome. Thank you so much, Nick. And yeah, putting the plug in for solidarity and showing up for each other's struggles and reimagining the world that we want is really exciting stuff, and I think is really the purpose in many ways of this webinar and the structure that we're pursuing as organizers and advocates for Palestinian rights, which is to stop this sort of siloed, fragmented version of of advocacy and building something stronger across movements. That we're in this together. So I have Rebecca and Christian, and I'll let you unmute yourself as you would like. Rebecca, are you ready?
Yeah. Hi, can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
Okay, sorry. It was like going back and forth. So I think like, what Nick was saying about, focusing the love on the land versus the nation is really important. And when I think about for Jews of color and the Jewish community more broadly, we also have a lot of work to do around trauma. I think every oppressed community does, but so much of the cycles of like nationalism in the Jewish community have to do with trauma. So I think that there's like internal work that we have to do of turning our cycles of trauma into like cycles of liberation, instead of saying, well, this was inflicted on me, so I have the right to inflict violence on other people. We have to find a way to intervene with that. And I think that's very like personal work that we as like folks in the Jewish community have to do. And I think that there's also like the broader work of like building with Palestinians and realizing that when we're talking about Palestine, like I'm in the United States living on like occupied indigenous land here, and I have a lot of interest in like I'm also African American, like working with Native folks from that position. But yeah, I think that like letting go of the idea that a nation will or nationalism and the way that it's been enacted through Zionism will ever protect Jewish people, and instead like realizing that our struggles and the oppression of Black and brown and Soviet Jewish populations is built on top of the oppression of Palestinians. So there's no way for us to actually be free while the oppression of Palestinians is happening, and to know that our liberation doesn't exist without the liberation of Palestinians. And when you're talking about the United States, the liberation for me as like a Black Jewish person doesn't exist without liberating the land itself. So I think just like cycling back to what both Yusuf and Nick were saying is really important, but also like, as a settler population, we have to do our own work so that we're no longer like inflicting our pain and trauma onto other people and calling that liberation, because I can't think of anything that's less liberating than that.
Thank you, Rebecca. A comrade said that we need to make sure and resist that our visions of liberation are not just settler dreams. And I think that it's a very important task for all of us to do as we're seeking liberation. Christian, close us out.
Okay. Let's see. So a lot of this feels in the abstract or the ideal for me, because the short answer is like, what is a citizen? You can say it's a human who's born in a territory. Wait, no, because people can be born here and deported. Is it the core of it is we're humans, and that should be the common denominator that determines what your, not even rights, just what your existence is, regardless of where you're living. But we're very, 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 very far from a world where that understanding is a material reality. And so as we fight towards that, I wanted to bring in something Nadia said yesterday, that when you combine the middle and the bottom, you get a supermajority. And so we might not yet have a clear vision of what decolonization or what life looks like without the citizenship of the US or Israel at the moment. But if you bring together indigenous people with Black people, with undocumented people, with poor people, we are the majority of oppressed people on this land, and collectively we can figure out the type of society that works best for us. And it's similar in Palestine. And I wanted to stress that I'm separating nationhood, because there is a Palestinian nation and a national identity, from statehood, which for pretty much every formerly colonized people has meant being indebted to the IMF and the World Bank. It's meant being subservient to the West and the North. And that's not the path that we want our family in Palestine to take. That's not going to be true liberation. And so I just wanted to end with a remark from somebody else in Black for Palestine, who said that there seems to be an attempt to sift and sort Palestinians from Gaza from those from within 48. and those outside 48 from those in the diaspora. It's up to the Palestinian people to lead in the negotiation of these nuances and to parse these precarities. But one thing that we can do as accomplices is insist on the wholeness of the Palestinian people and not assent to the notion that citizenship in a problematic nation is a solution or an end game. And so we have to insist that Palestinians, whether they're born in Israel or the West Bank or Gaza or Ain al-Hilwi camp in Lebanon or Yarmouk camp in Syria, they are part of one nation, and that they as a people have a right to determine how they want to live on the land that they're from. And so with that as a starting point, those of us that are in solidarity can get behind whatever solutions or outcomes the people as a whole decide. But at the moment, we have to uphold Palestinians' rights to determine for themselves what citizenship on their own land looks like.
Wow. Thank you so much. We want to kind of close off. I know we have a few questions on the side, and I will gather those questions and we'll compile them, and we'll also as panelists kind of go over some of the questions that we weren't able to answer and send those responses in a follow-up document that will also include additional reading and some resources and how you start returning to your communities, to your families, and discussing these issues. And I think I will just open it up to Anna to close if there's any other questions that we have. Thank you all so much. This was a fascinating hour. I'm so grateful and honored to have been a part of it with you all. And Anna, if you have any last questions or comments for our folks, thank you again for being here.
Yeah, no, just to thank the panelists and you, Nadia, for facilitating. This has been really powerful, and we'll post it online. You should be able to share with your friends and followers and to continue this important conversation. So I'm going to end the recording and end the webinar and just say onward. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.